The black limousine glided to a stop outside Celestia, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, and Maya Chen felt her stomach twist into knots that no amount of breathing exercises could untangle. She'd been working for Nexus Global Corporation for exactly 3 weeks, and in that time she'd learned that her boss, Mr. Varek, was unlike anyone she'd ever encountered, and not just because of his meteoric rise in the business world or his reputation for ruthlessness that made grown executives weep in bathroom stalls. There was something else, something she couldn't quite name, that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up whenever he entered a room. The driver opened her door and she stepped onto the sidewalk, her Louboutin heels clicking against the pavement with a sound that felt too loud, too attention-grabbing, too much like announcing her presence to a predator. Maya was 26 years old, fresh out of an MBA program at Wharton, and she'd thought she was ready for the corporate world, thought her father's billions and her own intelligence would shield her from anything life threw at her. But 3 weeks with Varek had stripped away every illusion she'd held about power and control. The restaurant's facade gleamed with warm light, all polished brass and pristine windows that reflected the city back at itself, and she could see other diners inside, laughing and enjoying their meals like normal people who didn't work for aliens disguised as humans. Wait, that thought stopped her cold on the sidewalk, causing a businessman behind her to grunt in annoyance as he swerved around her. Aliens, that's what she'd been thinking, what she'd been suspecting for days now but hadn't dared put into words even in the privacy of her own mind. Miss Varek wasn't human, couldn't be human, not with the way his eyes sometimes caught the light wrong, reflecting it back like a cat's, or the way his fingers were just slightly too long, the joints bending at angles that looked almost right but felt fundamentally wrong. She'd noticed other things too, the way he never seemed to eat or drink anything during their 14-hour workdays, the way his skin had a texture like fine leather when she'd accidentally brushed against him in the elevator, the way he could make people agree to anything with just a look, as if he was reaching into their minds and rewiring their thoughts. The doorman pulled open the brass-handled door and warm air rushed out to greet her, carrying with it the scent of truffle oil and expensive wine and the quiet murmur of wealth, having conversations about more wealth. Maya forced herself to walk inside, her legs moving on autopilot while her mind screamed at her to run, to get back in the car, to call her father and tell him she was quitting. But she couldn't do that because her father had been the one to get her this position, had called in favors and twisted arms and reminded people of debts owed to get his daughter a spot at one of the fastest-growing companies in the world. The maitre d' recognized her immediately, his professional smile never wavering as he said her name and gestured toward the back of the restaurant where a private dining room waited. She followed him through the main dining area, past tables where normal people ate normal meals and probably went home to normal lives that didn't include bosses who might be extraterrestrial beings with unknown agendas. The private room was smaller than she'd expected, intimate in a way that made her claustrophobia spike, with a single table set for two, candles already lit and casting dancing shadows on walls covered in silk wallpaper that probably cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Mr. Varek was already there, standing by the window with his back to her, his tall frame silhouetted against the city lights like something out of a film noir, except the detective wasn't coming to save anyone, and the femme fatale was actually a terrified MBA graduate who was in way over her head. He turned when she entered and his smile was perfectly calculated, showing exactly the right amount of teeth, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that should have been warm but instead felt like being examined under a microscope. His suit was custom-tailored, probably Italian, definitely expensive enough to feed a small village for a year, and it fit him perfectly despite his frame being just slightly too tall, his shoulders just slightly too broad, his proportions just slightly off in ways that most people wouldn't notice but that screamed wrongness to anyone paying attention. Maya forced herself to smile back, forced herself to walk into the room instead of turning and running, forced herself to remember that she was a Chen, that she'd graduated top of her class, that she could handle one dinner with her boss no matter how unsettling he was. "Maya, thank you for joining me," Varek said, his voice smooth as silk and cold as winter, the kind of voice that made promises it had no intention of keeping. He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat, feeling like a mouse accepting an invitation to dinner with a snake, except snakes were at least honest about what they were and what they wanted. A waiter appeared as if summoned by telepathy, which honestly wouldn't surprise her at this point, and began pouring wine into crystal glasses that caught the candlelight and threw it around the room in tiny fragments of brightness. Varric watched her with those two bright eyes, his gaze never wavering, never blinking as often as a human should, and Maya found herself cataloguing every detail about him like her life might depend on remembering them later. His hair was dark, almost black, styled perfectly without a single strand out of place, even though she'd seen him running his hands through it during their marathon work sessions, and his skin had an odd quality to it, like it was slightly translucent if you looked closely enough, like you might see something moving underneath if the light hit it just right. I wanted to discuss your performance, he continued, lifting his wine glass but not drinking from it, just holding it in those two long fingers like a prop in a play he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Maya's heart rate kicked up another notch, because performance reviews weren't conducted over intimate dinners in private rooms, they happened in conference rooms with HR present and documentation and witnesses, not here in this candlelit space that felt more like a trap than a restaurant. She opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off with a raised hand, the gesture sharp and commanding, the movement of someone used to absolute obedience. "You've been watching me," he said, his voice dropping lower, the words carrying a weight that felt like accusation and threat and curiosity all mixed together. Maya's blood ran cold because she had been watching him, had been noticing things, had been piecing together the wrongness of him like a puzzle she didn't want to solve. "You've been asking questions, subtle ones, clever ones, the kind of questions that someone as intelligent as you would ask when they suspect something isn't quite right." He leaned forward and the candlelight caught his eyes wrong again, reflecting back with that greenish tint that human eyes didn't have, and Maya knew with absolute certainty that she was sitting across from something that looked human but absolutely wasn't. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a drum announcing her execution. Varric smiled wider, showing more teeth than before, and said, "I'm going to tell you a truth, Maya, and then you're going to make a choice." The words hung in the air between them like suspended animation, like the moment before a car crash when you know impact is inevitable but it hasn't happened yet, when your brain is screaming at you to do something but your body hasn't caught up. "I'm not from here," he continued, his voice almost casual now, like he was discussing the weather or quarterly earnings instead of confirming her worst suspicions. "I'm from a place you couldn't comprehend, from a civilization that was building cities when your ancestors were learning to use fire, and I came to your world because it has something we need." Maya wanted to laugh or scream or do something to break the unreality of the moment, but her voice had abandoned her, fled somewhere deep inside where it couldn't be reached. Varric stood up, his movements fluid and precise, and walked around the table until he was standing right beside her, close enough that she could smell something like ozone and metal, close enough that she could see the way his skin seemed to shimmer slightly under the candlelight. "Your world is rich with a mineral that doesn't exist anywhere else in the galaxy," he said, looking down at her with eyes that now showed flecks of that impossible green more clearly. "We've been harvesting it quietly for decades, running operations through legitimate businesses, and Nexus Global is just one of many companies we control." He reached down and touched her shoulder, his fingers cold even through the fabric of her dress, and Maya felt something like electricity run through her body, not painful but deeply wrong, like her nervous system was being scanned and catalogued. "You're smart enough to understand the implications," Varric continued, his hand still on her shoulder like a brand marking her as his. "Your father's companies have access to resources we need, mining operations in remote locations, shipping networks that move materials without questions, and you are going to help us acquire those assets." The words finally broke through her paralysis and Maya jerked away from his touch, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and she stood up so fast she almost knocked over her untouched wine glass. "You're insane," Maya said, her voice coming out stronger than she felt, years of private school training and corporate presentation courses kicking in even when her world was collapsing around her. Varric laughed, the sound wrong and mechanical, like someone who'd learned to laugh from watching videos but didn't understand the emotion behind it. "I assure you, I'm quite sane by any definition your species uses," he replied, taking a step toward her while she took a step back. "This dance of predator and prey playing out in a room designed for romance and business deals, not for revelations about alien invasions." Maya's mind was racing, cataloging exits and weighing options, and trying to remember anything she'd ever read about what to do when confronted by an extraterrestrial being. But her expensive education hadn't covered that particular scenario. "You can't possibly think I'll help you," she said, backing up until her shoulders hit the silk-covered wall, the expensive fabric cool against her skin. Varak tilted his head in a way that was definitely not human, the angle too extreme, the movement too smooth, and said, "I don't think you'll help me willingly, but that's irrelevant." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like someone had miniaturized a smartphone and made it out of materials that didn't exist on Earth, all crystalline surfaces and pulsing lights that hurt to look at directly. "This is a compliance inducer," he explained, his tone shifting into something like a professor lecturing a particularly slow student. "It will override your neural pathways and make you very agreeable to any suggestion I make, very eager to please, very willing to do whatever I ask without question or hesitation." Maya felt her blood turn to ice because this wasn't just corporate espionage or business intimidation. This was something far worse, something that violated her at a fundamental level. "Your father will notice," she said desperately, grasping at any argument that might save her. "He'll know something is wrong. He'll investigate. He'll expose you." Varak's smile was pitying now, the expression of someone explaining reality to a child who still believed in fairy tales. "Your father is already compromised," he said, the words hitting her like physical blows. "He's been working with us for 6 months, providing access to his company's resources in exchange for technology that's making him even richer, even more powerful, and he was the one who suggested we bring you into the operation." The betrayal cut deeper than the fear, slicing through her defenses and leaving her exposed and vulnerable in ways she'd never experienced. Her father, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework and walked her down the aisle at her sister's wedding, had sold her out to aliens for profit. The device in Varak's hand pulsed with light that seemed to reach into her brain, and she could feel something probing at the edges of her consciousness, testing her defenses, looking for a way in. She screamed, the sound raw and primal, and lunged toward the door with every ounce of strength she had left. Her hand closed around the door handle and she yanked it open, stumbling out into the main dining room, where normal people were still eating normal meals, and she screamed again, louder this time, her voice cutting through the quiet conversation and classical music like a siren announcing disaster. "He's trying to hurt me," she shouted, pointing back at the private room where Varak was emerging, his face arranged in an expression of concern that looked almost convincing if you didn't know what lurked behind it. "Please, someone help me. He's not human. He's going to do something to me." The other diners stared at her with expressions ranging from concern to annoyance to embarrassment, the way wealthy people looked at anything that disrupted their carefully constructed bubble of privilege. And Maya realized with sinking horror that no one was going to help her because she looked like a crazy woman having a breakdown, not like someone fleeing from an alien threat. Varak walked toward her slowly, his hands raised in a placating gesture, his voice pitched to carry to the other diners as he said, "Maya, please, let's talk about this calmly. You're clearly overwhelmed by the pressure of your new position." His words were calculated to paint her as unstable as someone cracking under stress, and she could see people nodding in understanding, could see them buying his performance. She backed toward the restaurant's main entrance, her eyes wild, searching for anyone who might believe her, anyone who might see past Varak's disguise to the monster underneath. The maître d' approached with the practiced calm of someone trained to handle awkward situations, his professional smile firmly in place, and Maya knew she was running out of time, running out of options, running out of any hope of escape. "That's enough," a voice said, cutting through the tension like a knife through butter, and Maya turned to see a waitress stepping forward from where she'd been clearing a nearby table. The woman was in her early 30s maybe, wearing a simple uniform that marked her as staff rather than one of Celestia's usual high-end servers, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face showing none of the carefully maintained beauty that most women in this restaurant wore like armor, and her eyes held something Maya recognized instantly as the look of someone who'd seen terrible things and survived them. The waitress walked toward them with purpose, her movements confident despite her position being so far below everyone else in the room, and she placed herself directly between Maya and Varak, one hand raised toward the alien businessman, in a stopping gesture that looked almost casual but felt like a wall going up. "I said that's enough," she repeated, a voice carrying authority that had nothing to do with wealth or status or power, the kind of authority that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere earned through hard experience. Varek's expression shifted, his mask of concern slipping for just a moment to show something calculating underneath, and he focused his attention on this new obstacle with the intensity of a laser. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his voice still pleasant but with an edge now, a warning that most people would have heeded. The waitress didn't budge, didn't show even a flicker of the fear that Maya felt radiating from her own body like heat. "I'm making it concern me," she replied, and there was something in her stance, in the way she held herself, that suggested she knew exactly what Varek was, what he was capable of, and wasn't impressed. Maya stared at this woman who'd just stepped into a situation that could get her killed or worse, this stranger who had no reason to help her, and every reason to stay out of it, and felt hope flickering in her chest for the first time since entering the restaurant. Varek studied the waitress with those two bright eyes, his head tilting again in that unsettling way, and said, "You're military, former special forces if I'm reading your stance correctly, probably dishonorably discharged based on your current employment situation, and you have extensive training in close combat situations." The waitress smiled, the expression cold and sharp, and replied, "Rangers actually, and the discharge was honorable despite what they put in the paperwork, and yeah, I've got training in lots of situations including how to handle threats that aren't exactly from around here." The revelation hung in the air like smoke, like this waitress somehow knew what Varek was, had experience with his kind, and Maya felt the dynamic in the room shift from her being a lone victim to something more complex, more dangerous, with alliances forming that she didn't fully understand. Varek's fingers twitched toward his jacket pocket where that device waited, but the waitress moved faster than Maya would have thought possible, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist with precision that spoke of countless hours of training and real-world application. "Don't even think about it," the waitress said, her voice dropping lower, harder, the tone of someone delivering a final warning. "I know what that thing does, and I know you need both hands free and about 3 seconds to activate it, and I promise you won't get any of those things." Other diners were starting to stand up now, some moving toward the exit, others pulling out phones to record what they thought was just an interesting confrontation, none of them understanding that they were witnessing first contact going very wrong in real time. The maitre d' was on his phone, probably calling security or the police or both, and Maya knew that in about 2 minutes this situation was going to escalate in ways that would make the current tension look like a friendly disagreement. "Who are you?" Maya asked the waitress, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't take her eyes off Varek but replied, "My name's Maya Chen, and before you ask, no relation despite the last name, and I've been tracking your boss for about 6 months now, ever since I noticed patterns in missing persons reports that matched other cases I worked on in the service." Maya Chen, not related but carrying the same name as Maya's father, and apparently connected to some kind of military operation that dealt with extraterrestrial threats, which meant that maybe Maya wasn't crazy, maybe there were people who knew about the aliens, maybe there was a chance of stopping whatever Varek had planned. Varek pulled his wrist free from Sarah's grip with a movement that was too fast, too strong, definitely not human, and he stepped back, his expression now showing calculation rather than the fake concern from before. "We need to move now," Sarah said, grabbing Maya's arm with a grip that was firm but not painful, the kind of hold that said "trust me" without using words. Maya didn't argue, didn't question, just let herself be pulled toward the kitchen entrance while Varek stood perfectly still in the dining room, watching them go with an expression that suggested he was allowing this escape, rather than being unable to prevent it, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd chased them. The kitchen was chaos, all clanging pots and shouting chefs and heat radiating from industrial stoves, and Sarah navigated through it like she'd memorized the layout, pulling Maya between prep stations and around startled line cooks who barely had time to register their passage before they were gone, out the back door, and into an alley that smelled like garbage and grease, and a particular urban decay that expensive restaurants tried to hide from their wealthy clientele. The night air hit Maya's face like a slap, cold and shocking after the controlled temperature of the restaurant, and she gulped it in while Sarah pulled out a phone that looked nothing like any smartphone Maya had ever seen, its screen displaying information in colors that hurt to look at directly. "He'll have people watching the main streets," Sarah said, her fingers flying over the strange device's surface with practiced ease. We've got maybe 3 minutes before his security team locks down this entire block, so we need to move fast and move smart. Maya's Louboutins were absolutely not designed for running through Manhattan alleys, but she kicked them off without hesitation, the expensive shoes clattering against the pavement like small protests, and followed Sarah in her bare feet over concrete that was cold and dirty and probably covered in things she didn't want to think about. They ran through a maze of service alleys and loading docks, past dumpsters and delivery trucks and the hidden infrastructure that kept the city running, and Maya's lungs burned with effort while her mind tried to process everything that had happened in the last 15 minutes. Sarah led them to a battered Honda Civic that looked like it had seen better days. About a decade ago, its paint faded and its bumper held on with what appeared to be duct tape and prayer, and Maya almost laughed at the contrast between this vehicle and the limousine she'd arrived in, like she was traveling backward through economic classes with each step away from Varric. "Get in," Sarah ordered, unlocking the doors with a key fob that was actual metal, not the electronic kind that Maya's father's cars used. Maya climbed into the passenger seat while Sarah started the engine, which coughed and sputtered before finally catching with a sound that was more determination than mechanical efficiency. They pulled out into traffic and Sarah drove with the confidence of someone who knew every street and alley in the city, her eyes constantly checking the mirrors, watching for pursuit that Maya knew was coming. "You said you've been tracking Varric," Maya said once she caught her breath enough to speak, her voice shaking slightly from adrenaline and fear, and the overwhelming relief of not being alone in this nightmare. "Tell me everything." Sarah navigated through traffic with aggressive efficiency, cutting between taxis and delivery trucks with inches to spare, and said, "About 8 months ago I was approached by a man who claimed to work for a classified government program called Sentinel, which monitors and responds to extraterrestrial activity on Earth. And yet, I know how crazy that sounds, but he showed me evidence that made everything I'd seen during my service suddenly make sense." She ran a red light, the Civic's engine whining in protest, and continued, "Turns out the government's known about aliens for decades. Multiple species, multiple agenda, and some of them are here harvesting resources while others are just observing, and a few are actively hostile to humanity's continued existence." Maya processed this information, each word adding another layer to a reality that had completely overturned everything she thought she knew about the world. Varric's people, they're called the Collective, and they've been operating on Earth for about 50 years, slowly infiltrating businesses and governments, always staying just below the radar, never drawing enough attention to trigger a coordinated response. Sarah's phone made a sound like wind chimes crossed with static, and she glanced at it, her expression tightening. "We've got company, black SUV, 2 blocks back. Definitely Varric's people, and they're going to try to box us in at the next intersection." Maya twisted in her seat to look behind them and saw the vehicle Sarah had mentioned, its windows too dark to see inside, its movements through traffic too smooth, too coordinated, definitely not a normal driver heading home from work. Sarah took a hard right turn that made the Civic's tires squeal in protest, the steering wheel spinning through her hands with practiced precision, and they shot down a narrow side street that barely had room for one vehicle, let alone the traffic Sarah was creating by driving the wrong way down what was clearly a one-way street. Horns blared and drivers shouted obscenities that Maya couldn't hear, over the blood pounding in her ears and the engine's laboring roar. "My father," Maya said, the words coming out choked and angry. "Varric said he's been working with them, that he's the one who brought me into this. Is that true, or was he just trying to break me?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, a flash of sympathy crossing her face before the tactical mask came back. "Your father's complicated," she said, yanking the wheel to avoid a delivery truck that appeared from nowhere. "He's been compromised for about 9 months, but not the way Varric implied, not willingly at first anyway." She glanced at Maya, her eyes serious, and continued, "The Collective has technology that can influence human decision-making, not complete control like what Varric was going to use on you, but subtle manipulation, making their suggestions seem reasonable, making cooperation seem like the smart choice." Maya felt something twist in her chest, a complicated mix of relief that her father hadn't simply sold her out and anger that he'd let himself be manipulated, that he'd exposed her to danger without warning her. "So what do we do?" she asked, watching the SUV appear in the side mirror, still pursuing despite Sarah's evasive driving. "We get you somewhere safe, and then we figure out how to shut down Varroc's operation before he can implement whatever he's planning, because I promise you, getting access to your father's resources is just the first step in something much bigger. Sarah pulled into a parking garage, the kind of anonymous concrete structure that existed in every major city, and spiraled down through the levels until they were deep underground, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead like dying stars. She parked in a corner spot that was covered by security camera blind spots, killed the engine, and turned to face Maya fully for the first time since the restaurant. "Here's what you need to understand," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower, more intense. "The collective isn't just here for resources, they're preparing for an invasion, a full-scale takeover that will happen within the next 6 months if we don't stop them, and they've been seeding agents throughout every major government, every major corporation, every position of power and influence they can access." Maya felt the weight of those words settle over her like a physical burden, the responsibility of knowledge that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did Varroc single me out specifically, instead of just manipulating my father more?" Sarah pulled out her strange phone again and swiped through screens of data that meant nothing to Maya, walls of text in multiple languages, images of documents and surveillance photos and maps marked with locations that glowed in different colors. "Because you're resistant," Sarah said, holding up the phone to show a graph of some kind, all lines and numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. "About 1% of humans have a natural immunity to collective manipulation technology, something in your neural chemistry that makes their influence bounce off, and they didn't know you had it until you started working there and their standard compliance measures didn't work on you." Maya stared at the graph, at the implications of what Sarah was saying, and felt something shift inside her from victim to potential weapon. "They wanted to use the direct device on you because the subtle stuff wasn't working, wanted to break through your resistance and turn you into a puppet anyway, because your father's connections are too valuable to lose even if it means taking more drastic measures." The parking garage was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional sound of a car passing on the levels above them, and Maya took a moment to really look at Sarah, this woman who'd risked everything to help a stranger who'd been fighting a secret war while everyone else went about their normal lives oblivious to the danger. "You saved me," Maya said, the words inadequate to express the gratitude and awe she felt. Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with the acknowledgement, and replied, "I did my job, which is keeping people safe from threats they don't know exist, and besides, you might be the key to stopping Varroc's entire operation." She pulled up another screen on her phone, this one showing a schematic of some kind of facility, all corridors and rooms marked with technical specifications. "The collective has a central hub in New York, underground facility where they coordinate their North American operations, and we've never been able to penetrate it because their security systems are beyond anything human technology can buy." "But you could get in," Sarah continued, her eyes bright with possibility and planning. "Your biometric signature is already in their system. You have access codes and security clearances, and more importantly, your neural resistance means you can move through their facility without being detected by their mental scanning technology." Maya felt her stomach drop, because she'd just escaped from Varroc and now Sarah was suggesting she walk right back into danger, except this time instead of being a victim, she'd be a spy, an infiltrator, someone actively working against an alien invasion force. "I can't," she said automatically, the words coming from a place of self-preservation that had kept her safe for 26 years. "I don't have any training, I don't know anything about espionage or combat, I'll just get caught and then they'll really do something terrible to me." Sarah nodded like she'd expected this reaction, like she'd heard it before from other people she'd recruited into this secret war, and her expression was understanding but firm. "You're right that you don't have training, but we've got about 48 hours before Varroc implements the next phase of his plan, which involves using your father's shipping network to distribute collective technology to every major city in North America, technology that will let them influence millions of people simultaneously." She pulled up more data on her phone, showing shipping manifests and route maps and delivery schedules that painted a picture of coordination that was terrifying in its scope. "If that happens, the invasion won't need to be military, because they'll control enough key people to simply take over peacefully, with humanity welcoming their new overlords because we'll be too manipulated to understand what's happening." Maya looked at the data, at the evidence of a plan so vast and so terrible that her mind struggled to fully comprehend it, and felt something in her spine straighten, some core of stubbornness that had gotten her through business school and family politics and every other challenge she'd faced. "What would I need to do?" she asked, not quite believing she was considering this, but unable to walk away from the knowledge that she could make a difference. Sarah's expression shifted to something like respect mixed with relief, and she began outlining a plan that sounded insane but might actually work if everything went perfectly, which Maya knew from her MBA courses was a terrible assumption to make about any plan. "The facility has a central server that controls all their operations in this region, and if we can access it, we can upload a virus that Sentinel has been developing, something that will corrupt their systems and buy us enough time to coordinate a larger response." Sarah swiped through more screens, showing the virus in action in simulation, cascading failures spreading through networked systems like dominoes falling. "You'd need to physically access the server room because their isolation protocols prevent any remote intrusion. Insert this drive." She held up a small device that looked like a USB stick made of materials that didn't exist on Earth, and then extract before their security protocols can neutralize you. Maya took the drive, its surface cool and slightly textured, humming with barely perceptible vibration that might have been her imagination or might have been alien technology at work. "And if I get caught?" she asked, needing to understand the full scope of what she was agreeing to. "You'll stay here tonight," Sarah said, locking the door behind them and engaging what looked like 3 additional security measures that definitely hadn't come from any hardware store Maya knew about. "We've got about 12 hours to get you as prepared as possible for tomorrow, which isn't nearly enough time, but it's what we have, so we're gonna make it count." Maya looked around the apartment at the laptop on the table showing continuous streams of data, at the equipment in the corner that looked like it belonged in a gym or a military training facility, at the walls covered in photos and documents connected by red string like something out of a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except this conspiracy was real and actively trying to enslave humanity. Sarah handed her a bundle of clothes, practical items that were a far cry from Maya's designer wardrobe, jeans and a t-shirt and sneakers that looked worn but comfortable. "Change into these. You need to be able to move without restriction, and then we're gonna run through some basic scenarios." Maya changed in the bathroom, which was as sparse as the rest of the apartment, just a sink and toilet and shower that had seen better days, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Without her makeup and expensive clothes, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow more real, like she'd stripped away the armor of wealth and was seeing her actual self for the first time. She came back out to find Sarah had cleared space in the middle of the room and was stretching with the ease of someone who did this regularly. "First lesson," Sarah said, gesturing for Maya to stand opposite her, "is how to handle yourself if someone tries to physically stop you, because even though your neural resistance protects you from their mind control, it doesn't make you immune to good old-fashioned violence." For the next 3 hours, Sarah taught Maya basic self-defense moves, how to break grips and create distance and target vulnerable points on an attacker's body, and Maya's muscles burned with effort while her mind absorbed the techniques that might keep her alive. They broke for food, delivered Chinese takeout that Sarah ordered from a place she trusted, and ate sitting on the floor while going over the facility layout again and again until Maya could navigate the corridors in her mind without looking at the map. "The collective aren't invincible," Sarah said between bites of Kung Pao chicken. "They're just technologically advanced and they've been planning this longer than we've been fighting back. But they make mistakes, they have blind spots, and your immunity to their influence is one of those blind spots." Maya absorbed this information, feeling something like confidence building in her chest alongside the fear. "Tell me about Sentinel," she said, wanting to understand the organization she was now apparently part of. Sarah leaned back against the couch, her expression distant like she was remembering things that weren't entirely pleasant. Sentinel was formed in the 60s after the government realized that extraterrestrial contact was real and ongoing. Started as a small group of military personnel and scientists, and has grown into a global network that operates in the shadows, unfunded by any official budget, staffed by people who've seen too much to go back to normal life. She looked at Maya with eyes that held decades of experience despite her age. "We recruit from military washouts and intelligence community burnouts and civilians who stumble into the truth and can't look away, people like you who end up in the wrong place at the right time, and have to choose whether to fight or hide. Maya thought about that choice, about how just hours ago she'd been trying to build a corporate career and now she was training to infiltrate an alien facility, and realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were just acknowledgments of responsibility that you couldn't ignore once you knew it existed. They trained more, Sarah teaching Maya how to use the watch device, how to interpret its warnings and follow its guidance, how to move through a space like she belonged there even when every instinct was screaming danger. Confidence is 90% of infiltration, Sarah explained, demonstrating the proper posture and gait. If you move like you're supposed to be somewhere, most people won't question it. Their brains just accept the reality you're projecting. Maya practiced walking with purpose, practiced maintaining calm expressions while her heart raced, practiced all the small performances that would keep her alive tomorrow. As the night wore on and exhaustion set in, Sarah finally called a halt to the training and showed Maya to the small bedroom, barely big enough for the single mattress on the floor, but infinitely more comfortable than Maya would have expected given the circumstances. Maya stood outside the Nexus Global building at 8:30 the next morning, her borrowed business clothes crisp and professional, her hair styled with products Sarah had somehow procured overnight, and the watch device hidden under her sleeve pulsing with gentle warmth against her skin. She took a deep breath, pushed through the revolving doors and entered the lobby with the confident stride Sarah had drilled into her during their hours of practice. The security guard at the desk looked up, recognized her, and waved her through with barely a glance, his attention already returning to whatever game he was playing on his phone, and Maya felt her first small victory as she swiped her ID badge and passed through the scanners without incident. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt longer than usual, each second stretching out like taffy, while Maya's mind replayed the plan over and over, every step memorized until it was automatic. The doors opened onto the executive suite, where she'd spent the last 3 weeks, all polished marble and expensive art, and the quiet hum of power consolidating itself, and Maya walked to her desk like this was just another normal day instead of the day she was going to either save humanity or destroy the resistance trying. Her computer booted up normally, emails flooding her inbox with the usual demands and requests, and she spent the next 2 hours working on legitimate tasks, building her alibi, establishing that everything was fine and she was the loyal employee they expected her to be. Varek appeared at 10 o'clock, his tall frame blocking the light from her window, and Maya looked up with an expression she'd practiced in Sarah's bathroom mirror, contrite and embarrassed and eager to make amends. "Mr. Varek," she said, standing up and smoothing her skirt with nervous hands that weren't entirely acting, "I'm so sorry about last night. The stress of the new position just overwhelmed me, and I completely overreacted. It won't happen again." Varek studied her with those 2 bright eyes, his gaze intense and searching, and Maya felt the watch device pulse twice rapidly against her wrist. Sarah's signal that collective scanning technology was active and attempting to read her thoughts, but her neural immunity held, her mind remaining her own, and after a moment that stretched into eternity, Varek smiled that calculated smile and said, "I understand, Maya. Transitions are difficult and I should have been more sensitive to the pressure you're under. Consider it forgotten." The relief that flooded through her wasn't entirely fake because she'd just passed the first major test, convinced an alien intelligence that she was harmless and compliant, and earned herself the freedom to move through the building. At noon she stood up, grabbed her tablet like she was going to review documents, and told her assistant she needed to retrieve some files from archives on sub-level 3, a reasonable request that wouldn't raise any flags. The elevator descent to the sub-levels was different from going up, the numbers ticking down past ground floor into negative integers, the air pressure changing subtly, the lighting shifting from corporate bright to institutional dim, and Maya felt like she was descending into something ancient and dangerous that had been waiting underneath the city all along. Sub-level 3 was cooler than the upper floors, the air carrying a faint metallic tang that might have been industrial equipment or might have been alien technology, and Maya followed the watch device's guidance through corridors that looked normal enough, but felt wrong. The proportions slightly off, the angles not quite right, like the architecture was designed for beings who didn't share human spatial preferences. She passed other employees, mostly technical staff in casual clothes who barely glanced at her, their attention focused on tablets and equipment that looked more advanced than anything she'd seen on the upper floors. The watch pulsed 3 times, indicating she was approaching collective personnel, and Maya ducked into a supply room, her heart hammering while footsteps passed by in the hallway, voices speaking in a language that sounded like wind chimes and static, the same sounds Sarah's phone made, definitely not human. When the voices faded, she continued, following the device's guidance deeper into the sub-level, past laboratories and equipment rooms and storage areas filled with crates marked in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The server room door appeared around a corner, unassuming grey metal with a biometric panel beside it, and Maya approached with steady steps, even though everything in her body was screaming to run, to abort, to get back to safety while she still could. She placed her hand on the biometric scanner, felt it reading her fingerprint with technology that seemed to reach through her skin and verify her identity at a cellular level, then stared into the retinal scanner, while a beam of light that was almost but not quite visible swept across her eye, and the door unlocked with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell opening. The server room was massive, stretching back into shadows that the emergency lighting couldn't quite penetrate, filled with equipment that looked like someone had taken human technology and rebuilt it according to completely different principles, all crystalline surfaces and organic curves and pulsing lights in colors that made Maya's eyes water. The central processor was exactly where Sarah's schematics had shown it would be, a towering structure in the middle of the room that hummed with power, and Maya ran toward it with the USB drive clutched in her hand like a talisman. The watch device on her wrist was counting down the seconds she had before automated security kicked in, 90 seconds when she entered, now 85, 84, each tick another heartbeat closer to success or failure. She found the access port, a slot that looked almost but not quite like a standard USB connection, and inserted the drive with shaking hands that somehow stayed steady enough to complete the action. The virus uploaded immediate code streaming into the collective systems like poison into a bloodstream, and Maya watched the progress bar on the tiny screen while alarms began to sound, first distant and then closer, the facility realizing it had been compromised and responding with mechanical fury. 70 seconds, 65, the watch counting down while the progress bar climbed, 60%, 70%, 80%, and Maya heard footsteps running toward the server room, multiple sets of feet moving with coordination that spoke of security teams mobilizing. 90%, 95, the progress bar hit 100%, and the drive ejected itself with a small pop, and Maya grabbed it and ran toward the door just as it was opening, a collective security officer, standing there with equipment that looked like a weapon and probably was. She didn't think, didn't hesitate, just did exactly what Sarah had taught her, went low and to the left using her smaller size and the element of surprise to slip past him while he was still processing her presence. The corridor outside the server room was flashing with emergency light, red and orange and that painful green color, and Maya ran with everything she had, her sensible work shoes, slapping against the floor while behind her the security officer shouted in that wind chimes language and more footsteps joined the pursuit. The watch device guided her through the chaos, showing her the fastest route back to the elevators, warning her when collective personnel were ahead, so she could dodge into side rooms or alternative corridors, and Maya ran like she'd never run before, her lungs burning and her legs screaming but her mind crystal clear with adrenaline and purpose. She burst into the elevator lobby just as Sarah had promised, and there was Sarah herself, her waitress uniform, replaced with tactical gear that made her look like she'd stepped out of a military recruitment video, and she was holding equipment that was definitely weapons and firing them at the pursuing security team. "Move, move, move," Sarah shouted, and Maya dove into the elevator while Sarah provided covering fire, her weapons making sounds that were nothing like conventional firearms, more like focused pressure waves that physically pushed targets back. The elevator doors closed with agonizing slowness while impacts hit the exterior, the metal denting but holding, and then they were rising, ascending toward ground level while behind them the virus did its work, spreading through collective systems like wildfire, and creating cascading failures that would take weeks to repair. They burst into the ground floor lobby where normal employees were standing around confused by the alarm, evacuating in orderly fashion because this seemed like a standard fire drill, rather than an alien installation being shut down, and Maya and Sarah joined the flow of people heading toward the exits, just two more workers escaping a building emergency, nothing to see. Outside in the bright afternoon sunlight that felt like benediction after the artificial lighting underground, Sarah grabbed Maya's arm and pulled her toward a different vehicle this time, an SUV that looked more reliable than the Honda, and they climbed in while around them the Nexus Global building continued to evacuate, hundreds of people streaming onto the sidewalks, none of them aware that the invasion they'd been unknowingly facilitating had just been dealt a major setback. Sarah drove away from the building with controlled speed, not fast enough to draw attention but not slow enough to seem suspicious, and Maya slumped in her seat, feeling exhaustion crash over her like a wave, the adrenaline that had kept her functioning finally draining away and leaving her hollow. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice carrying pride and relief in equal measure. "The virus is active and spreading through their entire North American network, shutting down systems and corrupting data, and buying us time to coordinate a larger response." Maya looked back at the Nexus building growing smaller in the side mirror, at the life she'd thought she was building and the future she'd thought she'd have, all of it revealed as illusion and manipulation, and she felt something shift inside her from victim to survivor to fight. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hoarse from running and fear, and the weight of what she'd just accomplished. Sarah glanced at her with a smile that was tired but genuine. "Now we join Sentinel officially. Now we take the fight to every collective operation on the planet. Now we help save a world that doesn't even know it needs saving." And Maya thought about her father, and Varek and all the people who'd been manipulated into serving an alien agenda, thought about the responsibility that came with knowledge and the choice that was really no choice at all, and she nodded, because walking away had never been an option, not really, not once she'd seen the truth behind the comfortable lies that most people lived with. The SUV merged into traffic and disappeared into the city, carrying two women who'd just struck a blow against an invasion that most of humanity didn't know existed, and somewhere in an underground facility, alarms were still blaring while collective systems crashed and burned, a small victory in a war that was far from over, but a victory nonetheless. Proof that humans weren't helpless, weren't sheep waiting for slaughter, were capable of fighting back against threats that came from beyond the stars.